Hi everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be a wrap up of the 15 books that I've read since my last wrap up video. So basically it's every book that I've read since mid-June. We're now in mid-August, so it's about 2 months. So in those 2 months I've read 15 books. I do try and do monthly wrap-ups occasionally, but sometimes it just doesn't work. Either I don't really read enough or I've just not found time at the end of the month. So I'm just trying to do them whenever I've got a big stack of books to talk about, and that time is now. So I only actually have 5 of the 15 books here physically. These are the ones that I own. I think I read 1 book from the library and I think the rest of them have all been on my Kindle. So I'm going to start with the book that I read first since that last video, which is actually one that I do have here, and it was also a 5-star read, and it is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I did mention this a little bit in my mid-year freakout tag, so if you've already watched that then you've probably already heard me talk about this, but I loved this book so much. I do prefer the other cover. At some point I think I might actually buy this edition and sell this one just because I like that one better, and I do want to reread this and annotate it someday, so it would just be nice to have the cover that I really want. But anyway, this book is about a girl called Vanessa. I think at the start of the book she's 15 and she ends up in a relationship with her 42-year-old English teacher. So we're seeing all this pan out through Vanessa's eyes, and then we're also following Vanessa in the future when she's in her 30s, and it's just come out that other students have accused the same teacher of also abusing them. So this is about Vanessa coming to terms with the fact that this was like a predatory, manipulative man who targeted young girls, and she's never really processed any of that. And as the reader you can see how this teacher is clearly manipulative, but he's doing it in a way that Vanessa blames herself. She believes that she's fully on board with this. So I love this book because it gave me a whole other understanding of being a victim of this kind of relationship and just how manipulative these abusers can be, to the point where in this case Vanessa is still defending him years later, and in order to protect herself from the reality of that she kind of denies it. So it was really interesting to see from that perspective. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like this before. It is very dark and disturbing, but it's not overly gratuitous or anything. But I would say you definitely need to be in the right headspace for it, because I finished this, I did cry, and I felt very down. It almost felt like a book hangover where I couldn't read anything for the next few days because I was still thinking about this. I was still very much in this world, in this headspace. It's hard to read Vanessa's perspective sometimes, but it's also a very important book, I think. And I finished this knowing more about this kind of topic than I did before, so that is always a good thing. The next book that I read was on my Kindle, and that was A Simple Plan by Scott Smith. I think this was one of my 5-star predictions, and unfortunately I've only given it 3 stars. This guy, his brother and his brother's best friend all stumble across this plane crash, and it's kind of hidden away so nobody's seen it, reported it or anything, and in the cockpit of the plane they find this massive bag of money, and they agree that they're going to split the money, but they're not going to say anything about it. They're not even going to tell their partners. They're going to wait 6 months, and the second that any news comes out about this missing money, I think they said they're going to destroy it or something. But if by the end of the 6 months nothing's come out, the plane's been discovered and nobody knows anything about this money, they've agreed that they'll then spend it. So each of them would be millionaires at this point. This is the initial plan, and it quickly goes very bad. The whole book kind of spirals and everything just gets worse and worse and worse. But I didn't really get invested into the characters, and the main guy that you're following, he's got a wife and a baby, and the way that he talked about his wife and child was just very he wasn't bothered about them at all. So I didn't really root for him at all. I didn't really want him to be able to keep all this money. Sometimes it would feel quite slow and kind of tedious and like nothing was really going anywhere. I don't know, it felt kind of long. I also didn't really buy some of the stuff that was happening. I won't spoil anything, but certain things would happen and then time would go by and nothing would come of it, and I just didn't really believe that that would be the case. I also didn't really like the ending. I found it kind of anticlimactic. I also didn't buy the characters' decisions at the end, so I didn't love that side of it, but I did like the initial concept. I thought it was really fun. It was an interesting moral dilemma to put yourself in that position, think about what you would do, how far would you go to protect this money. But I also think that I'm not super into money oriented stories. Sometimes seeing the things that people do for money is a bit crazy to me, so I can't fully relate. Like for me, I would have just been giving that money up straight away, calling the police. But it was fun to see just how crazy this got. But I also think because I read The Ruins by Scott Smith last year, and I really loved that, I think I gave it 4.5 and then bumped it up to 5 stars. So I had really high hopes going into this one. I thought it would be another 5 star, and yeah, it just didn't live up to that. But I still gave it 3 stars and it was still an okay book. The next book I read was Look Closely by David Ellis, and this was a kind of similar book in a way because again it oriented around money and how far people will go for money. It's gonna be kind of hard to describe the plot of this book, but we start off the book with this girl who's potentially committed suicide or potentially been murdered. We've got the perspective of a guy who's obsessed with her. We follow quite a few different characters in this book, and there are a lot of moments where the author completely pulls the rug up from under you and everything changes, and I did really like those moments. It was very cleverly plotted. However, this book was way too long. I didn't realise how long it was. I think it's 450 pages, so it easily could have had like 100 pages cut out of this. It did not need that much. There were times when I found it kind of slow and I felt like it dragged. There were even a few times where I thought, I'm just going to DNF this because I wasn't fully enjoying it. I was getting a little bit too bored, even like towards the end. And it did have a good ending, so that did make up for it. But if I didn't know that going into it, I think I would have put this down like really late on just because I wasn't fully invested. I'm not sure I can fully root for people to just get money. Like I don't like that as a motive much. I don't know, I just find it a bit boring. So this is a weird one where I would recommend it to people. It had a really good payoff, but I also found it kind of boring at times, so I've settled on a 3 out of 5 for this, just because I find it very difficult to explain how bored I was, but also how clever I thought it was. It was probably one of the better thrillers I've read recently. It was just way too long. Next up, I finally read Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. Again, if you've watched my mid-year freakout tag, then you'll already have heard me rave about this book. I've given it 4.5 stars in the end. The ending let it down for me slightly, but everything else about this book I absolutely loved. We're following this main character called Irina, who is very toxic. She treats everyone around her very bad, but somehow they're still really obsessed with her. And she's just a fascinating character to read about. She was really funny. I liked all her commentary on things. And basically the story starts with her being hit at her job and she ends up getting some time off. So she instead focuses on her art career and she gets invited to take part in this exhibition. It's kind of plotless. It does have an end goal with this exhibition, but apart from that, we're just following Irina on her like day-to-day life. There's lots of drinking, drugs, sex, toxic femininity, but I just could not get enough. I kind of buddy read this with my boyfriend and he also really liked it, and I didn't think he would, but yeah, we both found it really funny. It's very British. One of the characters in this book is constantly referred to as Eddie from Tesco. The ending just was a little bit too confusing for me. I probably just didn't get it, but I couldn't give it a full perfect 5 stars just because of that, but everything else was just fab about it. The next book that I read was A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman, and this is a horror novella, although I'm not sure it's like full horror because it was kind of tame, about this couple who go on their first date and they discover this house under a lake and they decide to get some like scuba equipment and go back and see what's going on there. I did like this one. I liked the romance, I liked the creepiness and the eeriness of the whole thing. I do think it was more magical realism than horror though. There's not many horrifying scenes in there. It did get a little bit more scary towards the end, but there was nothing that I think was fully horrifying. Again, I'm not sure about the ending for this book. It was a little bit too confusing for me. I think I would have preferred more of a straight answer with this one, but I did like it overall, and I've given it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I don't really have many thoughts other than I enjoyed it, so if you're looking for something that's just like creepy and quick, then this would be a good one. Next was the Summerween Readathon, which I have already posted 2 vlogs where I read these books, but if you've not watched those videos or you've just forgotten, I will quickly talk about these books again, but I will put a timestamp on screen if you've already watched those videos and you don't really want to hear me repeat myself. But the first book that I read for that video was I Miss the World by Violet LeVoit, and it wasn't until I wrote this name down in my reading journal that I realised that LeVoit is a... oh, what's the word? What's the word for it? Where it's like a anagram? Is it anagram? Where it's an anagram of the word violet, so... I'm wondering if that's her real name, because the first name and the surname are anagrams of each other. That is the right word, isn't it? I think it is. Anyway, this book is a very short horror novella. I think it was about 100 pages, give or take, but this was a very strange little book where we're mainly following this conversation between a woman and her brother in a cemetery in Hollywood, and most of this book is literally just them chatting, and I kind of liked it. It was fun to read, but there were quite a lot of references to Hollywood culture and just other American things, I think, that I had no idea about. So I did have to Google quite a lot. I feel like it was a little bit too smart for me, but I did enjoy some of the things they were discussing. And then towards the end, it all of a sudden turns into something completely different, and I really liked the ending. And the language that this author used to talk about a specific character, I felt like I'd been hit myself, because it was so vicious and so vile, and I was just properly shocked by that, and I loved it. I did not see the ending coming whatsoever. However, there was a bit of a twist that I think I did see coming a little bit. I think I'm settling on, I know this is very specific and picky, but I think I'm going to give this book a 3.75, possibly like a 4, because I really loved the ending and I liked reading the conversation, but some of it didn't fully resonate with me just because I didn't get the references. So I'm somewhere between like a 3.5 and a 4. I'm probably going to give it a 4 on Goodreads, probably a 3.75 on Storygraph. The next book that I read for that video was Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. I really love Alice Feeney's books. I think I've given every one like a 4, 4.5, 5, except for this one. I'm giving this one 2.5 out of 5. Just to be very picky about it again. I didn't really like this book much at all. I liked the atmosphere. I think she's really good at writing an atmospheric setting. This book is set in an old family house, which is kind of in the middle of the sea, and when the tide comes in, nobody can get in or out of the house except for if they use a boat. So in this book, the Darker family are all meeting at this old house because it's the grandma's 80th birthday, and when 12 o'clock hits, the grandma is found dead, and then every hour after that somebody else is found dead. So I thought this would be a really fun book, but it turns out that we spent a lot of time in the past following Daisy Darker's history, and I found those bits kind of boring. There was a lot of home videos that we had to sit through, and it felt like the main mystery of who was killing off all these family members was kind of sidelined because we just weren't in that timeline very much at all, or at least it felt like that to me. I think I kept trying to pick this book up and just putting it down after a few pages because I just could not get into it. I also guessed the twist very early. I think in my video I said I guessed it on page like 60 odd, and for me it got really tedious because every time I kept picking up on this I was like, okay, are you going to tell me the twist now? Because I already know this is definitely happening. But from seeing other reviews, I don't think it's been that obvious to other people. So I don't know, maybe it was just my lucky day. One thing I'll say is that I did enjoy how one of the reveals was told to us, like the past timeline. I liked how that ended, but I wasn't so sure about how I liked the present timeline ending. It all just felt a little bit underwhelming, and it honestly didn't feel like Alice Feeney wrote this book, as in I was reading it and I wasn't getting that same Alice Feeney writing. I'm hooked, I'm engrossed, every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. If you told me that a different author wrote this book, I would have totally believed you. So unfortunately, I just didn't really like it. I'm giving it 2.5 because it wasn't bad. I still got through it, but I have seen a lot of positive reviews about this. So if you fancy reading this book, I would recommend reading it on Halloween because it is set on Halloween night, I think. So that would be a good time to read this if you want to do so. The next book I read was another horror novella, and it was This Is Where We Talk Things Out by Caitlin Marceau. This one was very short. I think it was about 70 pages, and we're following this woman who's reuniting with her mum, who she previously cut out of her life because she was a very toxic person for her. But her mum's been reaching out and she agrees to try and make amends with her. So they decide to go to this secluded snowy cabin together, which is always a good idea. And I did enjoy this book. I could see where it was going kind of early on, but I did think that the ending was very bleak and unexpected and sad. And I did root really hard for this main character, even with just the 70 pages that we had. The way that the mum would manipulate and gaslight the daughter was really hard to read just because of how frustrating it was. But all of that just made me root for the main character even more. It kind of reminded me of Misery by Stephen King, which I think I also gave a similar rating. By the way, I rated this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's just not my favourite kind of horror where it's between just two people. So if you liked Misery, then you would like this. It was still a very good, quick, fun read, just not one that I'm going to be like thinking about a ton. The next book that I read for that readathon was Penpal by Dathan Auerbach. This was my favourite book from the readathon. I think I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 stars. This is about a young boy and it's kind of episodic where each chapter tells a different story from this young boy's life, kind of revolving around this stalker that he has. I was expecting this to be really scary and there were definitely some eerie, frightening moments, but it didn't go as horrifying as I thought it would, until we got to the ending, and I was very upset by that ending. I've seen that this is meant to be an extreme horror, and I wouldn't have initially categorised it as extreme, just because there's not a ton of gore, violence, but I did see somewhere that it is more extreme psychological horror, and I would kind of agree with that actually, because the ending of this book almost made me cry. I wasn't expecting it at all, and I guess the whole story was quite sad and quite scary to think about. Just the idea that this unknown person is stalking a child. So from what I've seen that some people say this is extreme, I would consider that before you go into it. So I really liked the writing in this book. I loved the friendship. I loved the adventurous feeling of it. I always looked forward to picking this book back up. My only issue with it was that I was getting a bit confused with the timeline. Because the chapters weren't in chronological order and I would sometimes get a bit lost with where we were up to with the story. And I also thought that the kids read a little bit older than they were supposed to be. I think in the book they're like 5 or 6, and although it says that they've got a lot of freedom and they're allowed to play out a lot, for me they read more like 8 or 9. And then there was also this weird bit at the end. I did talk about it in my vlog, but yeah, there were just a few things that confused me a bit, but other than that I really liked this one. And then the last book that I read for the readathon was We Spread by Iain Reid. I think I had overly high expectations for this one. I've still given it 4 out of 5 stars, but I think I wanted a little bit more from it than what we got. This is about an elderly woman called Penny. She is a widow and she's kind of lonely. She's struggling to look after herself. So she goes to this residential home that her and her partner had apparently already paid for, but she can't remember it. And things start to get a little bit eerie and weird because things start happening and you're not sure if Penny's an unreliable narrator, because there are some hints that she might have dementia and she's having issues with her memory. So you're wondering if there's something wrong with the staff. Is there something wrong with the house in general? Is it Penny? So that is the real horror in this book. Growing old, losing your memory, losing your independence, losing your ability to look after yourself, and the scary thought that you can't trust yourself and you can't trust the people around you. It's really well written. There's some really nice conversations in there about being elderly and how we as society treat elderly people, kind of lump them all into one and they lose their individuality, and just how horrible of a viewpoint that is. And I think this book really got that across very well. I think it just wasn't the right horror that I wanted at that time, and I read it very quickly as well. I think I read it pretty much all in one sitting, so I'm wondering if I didn't let it process with me as much as I should have done. Maybe I should have spaced it out over a few days or something. It did make me think a lot as I was reading it, but I will admit I didn't really think much about it afterwards. But I did really love Penny as a character. She was super sweet and I did get a little bit teary-eyed at the ending. So I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 just because I think it has a lot of interesting things to say and I still enjoyed it. I still liked the creepy feeling. It's just not maybe what I wanted at that time. Then the next book that I read straight after the readathon was a little bit of a break from all the horror, and it was Tom Felton's autobiography. I knew I had to read this when it came out just because I love Harry Potter so much and I'm always so interested in the behind the scenes of the films, what it's like for the actors since being in Harry Potter and having that take over your entire life and kind of become who you are in a sense. So many people will just know Tom Felton for being in Harry Potter. To be honest, I didn't know half the stuff he was in afterwards. He does mention some of the things that he's been in since and I'd literally never heard of them. So it was interesting to see all of that. My favourite bits were his childhood and also his time in Harry Potter, obviously. He then talks about what it was like afterwards, and he also talks about a stint in rehab. And I say that I don't really like to rate non-fiction because it's somebody's life and you can't really judge somebody's experience in their life. However, I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5 just because it gave me all the nostalgic Harry Potter feels. How he turned into a little gang with the other Slytherins and how he treated the rest of the cast was just fun to read. However, I think he was a little bit too tame in this book, or maybe I've been tainted because the only other celebrity memoir I've read, I think, is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy, and she goes like full brutal in that book. She's not afraid to be completely open about her experiences, about people in her life, and I think that this one held back a little bit too much for my personal taste. I also think that Tom Felton seems to be a very positive, happy person in general, and it seems that in his adult life he's very spiritual and very into wellness and things like that. And it might just be that Tom Felton is a great guy and he genuinely sees the good in everybody, but I don't know, I wanted more goss, I wanted more detail. It seems like everyone that he met in Harry Potter was like an idol to him, was the best person he's ever met, super nice, he's so close to them. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, I'm just finding it hard to believe that on a film set where you've grown up, he openly admits that he was kind of a mischievous child. The way that he met Emma Watson, he was kind of mean to her. So I'm finding it hard to believe that he had such positive relationships with everybody on set, painting everyone as the best person that he'd ever met. There were also quite a lot of Harry Potter references throughout. He'd often call people muggles and stuff. I feel like a lot of this book is catering specifically for Harry Potter fans, and yeah, it just got a little bit old. And I also listened to some of the audiobook, so hearing him like say it as well was just a bit too much for me. Also, the part where he talks about his alcoholism, he's very much kind of in denial about it. He talks about how his whole family and his girlfriend at the time and his agents and everything all came together and did this intervention for him and said he had to go to rehab, and he kind of adamantly says he's not that bad, he was never that bad, there were people way worse than him, and that he only really went to rehab to appease them. Fair enough, but that opinion never really changed, and we never really fully saw him admit that he did have a problem with alcohol. He was very kind of dismissive of it. Plus, this might be me putting words into his mouth and saying that like this is what I wanted to hear from him, but as somebody who worked on Harry Potter, but as a side character, I thought there would be more about how it was finishing the films and trying to find work. There was mention of him having to audition again, but it never really got into the emotional side of it and how that affected him and how he felt about that. But then he does also talk about how he struggles to identify his own emotions and sometimes he just feels numb. So whether that's that, I just wanted a bit more of a deep dive into how it all made him feel. There was a mention of watching the 4th film with his family, and I think his dad made a joke to him like, oh, you weren't in that one very much, were you? And I wanted more on that. I wanted more on the alcoholism, on the rehab. I kind of just wanted more on everything. I feel like if he removed half of the like Harry Potter references and some of the repetition that we got as well, then I think he could have put a little bit more heart and soul into this. Saying that, it does feel weird talking about somebody's life because that might just not be who he is, that might not be his experience. But I think since reading Jeanette McCurdy's memoir and seeing just how deep she goes, I think that's kind of what I wanted from this and I wasn't getting it. The next book that I read after that was another depraved book, and that was Birdman by Mo Hayder. This is a police procedural crime thriller series. It's the first book in the series and it has been compared to Karen Slaughter and the Grant County series, which Obs is like my favourite thing of all time. So I went into this fully aware of how gross and violent it would probably be, and it definitely met my expectations. This was a really good book and I will definitely be continuing the series. We're following this detective called Jack. I think he's a detective inspector, and they are investigating this serial killer case where they've found all these bodies. I think they found like 5 bodies at the start. We also see a little bit about Jack's personal life, his love life. When he was younger, he had a brother who went missing, and he suspects that his neighbour had something to do with it. So we've got all that side story. It was really cleverly written where I was falling for every red herring and it would be a completely different theory instead, and I loved that. It is very violent though, and the ending of this book, there is some quite graphic sexual violence scenes which made me feel so sick. The villain was just horrible and disgusting, so it definitely did what it set out to do. So it was quite intense, and like I say, I will continue this series. I think I'm just gonna have to take breaks in between them because they are quite heavy. Some of the scenes from the ending of the first book are kind of stuck in my brain now, and I've heard that the second one is even worse. But the reason that I love books that go quite dark with this is because they have such an impact on me, which can be a good thing and a bad thing, but it makes me really invested in the story, invested in the characters, because I want them to be able to solve it. I want them to be able to stop what's happening. So that's why I read them, and they also just feel more like intense and on a different level than other books that I've read. Yeah, just a warning that this one is not for the faint of heart. So I wouldn't want to recommend it to someone who's never really read much police procedural crime stuff before, but if you're more of a seasoned reader and you're looking for something a little bit more intense, then I would definitely recommend this series so far. And then after that I went on holiday, so we went to Mallorca and I wanted to read some fun books. I only managed to read 2. So the first one that I read was The Last One by Will Dean. I read this one because the concept was just so fun. The back of the book literally says that this woman goes on a cruise liner, she wakes up and everybody on the ship is gone. Like, no staff, no crew, everybody's gone. And that is all you know going into it. And because I was away, I really just wanted those like cruise summer vibes. And this didn't really give me that because it was set in like November, I think. But it was still a fun read. The writing was very easy to get into. There's lots of very short chapters. Usually I love a short chapter, but with this one, there was, I think, over 100 and odd chapters, and some of them would end very like dramatic cliffhangery, but then in the next page, in the next sentence even, everything would be fine. Like, it would be a misunderstanding or whatever, and I really don't like that with books because the tension is just gone. So that kind of annoyed me a few times. I did think it was a tiny bit too long. I think it was well over 400 pages and it didn't need to be that long. Also, I'm not going to talk about any spoiler or anything, but when the twist reveal does happen, I didn't fully believe in the feasibility of what they were saying. Like, the initial bit, I didn't like it, and then I kind of warmed to it, and then it got to a certain point and I was like, oh, I'm fully on board for this now. And then the ending kind of turned it around again, and I didn't love the end reveal. However, the last line of this book, I was like, oh my god, I cannot believe he's just done that. That is hilarious. I really liked the last line, but I kind of wish that the little bit before that didn't really happen. If you've read this book and you want to chat spoilers, then let me know, because I really want to talk about this book, but you literally can't reveal anything because the blurb is so vague. But it was fun, it was interesting. I've given it 3 out of 5. Like I said, I had issues with the feasibility of it all. It was a bit too long. The cliffhanger chapters were a little bit annoying, and I wasn't 100% in love with the ending and all the reveals and stuff, so I would recommend it. It just wasn't perfect. And then the next book that I read on my holiday was Happy Place by Emily Henry. Now, I never read romance really. I don't know what it is. Contemporary romance just has never really appealed to me, but I've always wanted to dabble with romance because I've never really explored what I like about it and what I don't like. So I'm really happy to say that I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. This is about a couple who were engaged and they've split up for unknown reasons. However, they've been invited on this reunion with their old friends, so they've both turned up and they've agreed to pretend that they're still together just to make it okay for everybody else. So we've got a fake dating trope, we've got a second chance romance trope, there was all sorts of stuff. There was like forced proximity, same bed, all that kind of fun stuff, which normally I would find kind of cringe, but I really liked it in this case. There was the tension of finding out why they split up, but one of my favourite things about this book was the setting and the friendships. It felt very real and it felt very loving and nice, and also the setting. I think they were in Maine, next to a lake, and just the whole feeling of it was just nice. The tension with the romance I loved as well. Every time they would like get close to kissing, I was like, oh my god. I just didn't give it a 5 star because it didn't feel quite like a 5 star. Maybe like a 4.5 actually, because I don't have anything bad to say about it. I loved everything. Yeah, I'm going to say 4.5 just because there's nothing wrong with it. I would highly recommend it, especially if you don't read romance like me. I just like how this book didn't feel cringe at all. Even when there was like tropey things happening, I was like giggling away. So please let me know if you have any other romance recommendations for me, because that might be a nice way to break up my intense dark reading. And then the last book, which I've literally just finished I think a few days ago, is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and I've given this one 5 out of 5 stars. Boop boop boop. This is a sci-fi, if you can't tell by the wonderful cover art. We're following a character called Ryland Grace who's found himself on a spaceship in the middle of nowhere on his own, doesn't know why he's there, he's got amnesia. At the start he can't even remember his name, so remembering why he's there is a completely whole other thing, and I just loved it. I did listen to the audiobook and I would highly recommend the audiobook. I think for the first half I read it purely on audio, and then I've had the book for a while anyway, so I started reading the actual book and listening as I read it. But you definitely need the audiobook because the way that this book pans out, you just need the audio. It makes it so much better. I really loved Ryland as a character. He was really funny. The audiobook, I keep banging on about it, the audiobook narrator just made the text come to life. I was on edge the whole time. There's so much science in this, and he actually explains most of it in an accessible way. I didn't understand all of it, but it is pretty accessible, especially for someone who does not like science like me. He made it really interesting. You also get to see flashbacks as Ryland starts remembering things of how he came to be on this spaceship in the first place. Yeah, it was just perfect. There was one point where I cried at this book, and I was not expecting to cry, but I was fully like in tears, crying, sobbing, and the ending was perfect. The ending was absolutely perfect. I could not have asked for a better ending. It was heartwarming, it was heartbreaking, everything. It was just everything. It's definitely one of the best books I've read this year, and who would have thought that a sci-fi would be in my best books? Not me. I've heard that this is going to be turned into a film with Ryan Gosling as the main character, which is kind of strange to picture. I mean, I think he can pull it off because Ryan Gosling can pull anything off. I've just seen Barbie and he was so funny in that. He was like the perfect Ken. But I pictured this character a whole lot nerdier than Ryan Gosling. I think they start filming it next year, so it's going to be ages until it comes out. But I have high hopes because I think it would be such a good film. I just don't want them to ruin a certain element of it. And if you've read it, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. So that is all the books that I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for sticking around with me and listening this long if you have. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you've managed to get something new for your own TBR. Oh, also, I've not addressed. I have changed my channel name. A little bit of a story behind that. So I picked the name The Amber Approach a few years ago. I think I was inspired by like the Anna edit because I didn't really know what I wanted to film and post about yet. And then as the years have gone on, I've realised, yes, books is my thing. That is what I will talk about. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So The Amber Approach was just kind of a broad, all-encompassing thing, and yeah, I've wanted to change it for a while, but I didn't really know what to change it to. And then I asked my boyfriend, like, oh, what name should I pick? And he was like, Bugbear, obviously, because my name's Amber, obviously, and sometimes he will put random adjectives before my name and call me like sad bear, mad bear, sleep bear, things like that. And he was like, just call yourself Bugbear. I was like, oh my god, that is perfect. So we're changing ourselves into Bugbear. So I hope you like the name change. If you don't, I'm sorry, but I don't like the Amber Approach. It's too wordy. It's too like old now. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like me. So we're now Bugbear. But anyway, thank you for watching this video. Please give it a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video. Bye.